Is the Bible responsible for slavery? This is a question that most skeptics and even Christians ask. So I did a little bit of research and let me tell you what I learned. The short answer is no. The Bible is not responsible for slavery. A famous Christian named Charles Spurgeon quoted, "Moses did not institute slavery in any shape. The laws concerning it were made on purpose to repress it, confine it within very narrow bounds, and put it to an end eventually." I will be honest, the Bible doesn't necessarily say end slavery, but it does talk about how slaves should be treated. The law in Exodus 21 regulated slavery to make sure slaves were treated right and fairly. We can see in Exodus 21 verse 2, "If you buy a Hebrew slave, he may serve no more than 6 years. Set him free in the 7th year, and he will owe you nothing for his freedom." Back in this day, when this book was written, slaves were not forced to be slaves. You had the option to sell yourself into slavery. So if somebody wanted to sell themselves into slavery, somebody could buy them. Leviticus 25:39-40 also talks about the treatment of slaves. "If one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and is forced to sell himself to you, do not treat him as a slave. Treat him instead as a hired worker or as a temporary resident who lives with you, and he will serve you until only the year of Jubilee." That statement says, falls into poverty and is forced to sell himself to you. It's not talking about being forced by people. He just doesn't have enough money to provide for himself, so he's forced to put himself into slavery. Let's look at Exodus 21:5-6. "But the slave may declare, 'I love my master, my wife, and my children. I don't want to go free.'" If somebody did decide to sell themselves into slavery, they were a slave for 6 years. And on the 7th year, they had to be free unless they loved their master so much that they decided to stay. They could stay. They had the freedom to choose. Verse 3 talks about how slaves could have a wife if they wanted to. Verse 8 talks about how slaves cannot be sold to foreigners, and they could get married and get adopted into a family in verse 9. Let's look at Exodus 21 verse 20. "If a man beats his male or female slave with a club and the slave dies as a result, the owner must be punished." Let's go to Exodus 21 verse 26-27. "If a man hits his male or female slave in the eye